Mark Jeffries from Democrats for Education Reform, Reverend Ray Rivera, founder of Family Life Academy Charter School and lifelong social activist here in New York City, and Julian Vasquez-Heilig from Cal State Sacramento. So please welcome our panel on charters and
this one's working. Joy, you and I can pass that over. So, thank you, Steve, for having us here. I'm really excited for this panel on race and class. I'm particularly excited to have it take place in Long Island City. You may ask why. Well, in part, the reason I'm excited is that this is where Albert Shanker, president of the American Federation of Teachers, and really one of the originators of the charter school idea, grew up. He grew up here. And I wrote a biography of Al Shanker, and so spent some time here. Good to be back. And to start us off, I thought I'd just give a 30-second background on Al Shanker's vision of charter schools, because I think it's relevant to this discussion of race and class. So Al Shanker proposed charter schools with three themes in mind. The first is that they would be laboratories for experimentation that would cooperate with the traditional public school system rather than compete with the traditional public school system. That was principle number one. Second principle was that there should be places where teachers had greater voice than in the public schools. He saw this as a way of promoting teacher empowerment, that teachers have great ideas on how to improve schools for kids, and they ought to be given free rein to have that opportunity. And the third principle was school diversity or school integration. Al Shanker went to a school in Germany, Cologne, Germany, and saw Turkish immigrant students sitting next to native German students. And the learning was robust, and it benefited from that ethnic and economic integration. And so he saw charter schools as an opportunity to bring children of different backgrounds together. And many charter schools have gone in different directions. Some are faithful to Al Shanker's vision, some are not. But I think it helps provide some context for this discussion about race and class. So let's dive in. We are expecting that we will have a spirited discussion. I sent around some ideas for questions by email, and we already got some back and forth going between some of the panelists. So I think we'll have a really rich discussion today. So let's start off with kind of a big question. What you suggested to come up. Provide background. Charter schools are under attack. The NAACP has raised lots of concerns about charter schools. They are losing support in some of the public opinion polling. Massachusetts saw the effort to expand charter schools fail when they put to a public vote. So the central question, given all that, is are charter schools serving low-income and minority students as well or better than the traditional public schools? And I want to go first to Shavar and then to Julian, because they weighed in with some opinions on that, and then we'll bring everyone in.
Great. First, very happy to be here with my colleagues here. First, I want to start with just making the point that Democrats for Education Reform, we're very practical. We support whatever works for children. So I want to start with that. Right? Because some of these conversations to me are very stale, very predictable, and I get it in the political context. serves some people's interest to have these extreme conversations where everything is zero-sum. But we start with that. Whatever works for kids, we support. And what the Credo study, which is to many one of the most reputable studies we have on the advocacy of public charter schools, the Credo study showed that for black children, for low-income children, that public charter schools are generally outperforming traditional public schools, where kids are getting many more days of equivalence in learning in both math and in reading. There are some states where the results aren't as good, which is why you have to have good oversight and accountability. But generally, that study showed quite clearly that for black kids in urban cities who are low income, public charter schools are outperforming the district. And at the end of the day, this is what the parents and families know. Right? So it's nice for us to go into rooms and have these sort of conversations. I'm from the South Shore of New Jersey, and I'm here today because I got a scholarship to be able to go to a decent public school, and also a private school for college prep and high school, and I still live there. And the bottom line is, unfortunately, too many traditional public schools have not served low-income black and brown kids for many decades. And so parents and families are craving for alternatives. They know their families, they know their kids best. And there's a reason that the best performing public charter schools have a large waiting list, because the families understand that the best of these schools are providing alternatives that would otherwise exist. The Credo study, a national norm test, confirms that. And at the end of the day, though, I want to be very clear, we support whatever schools work. Some public charter schools do not work. If they don't work, close them. Intervene. It's not that deep as far as we're concerned. If the school is working and it is sending kids to college, so in North Wildland, we barely get 1 in 10 kids to college. So if we have a public charter school that's sending 6 and 7, 8 and 10 out of kids to college and beyond, we love it. We love traditional public schools like Science High School in my city, which for many decades has sent your kids to the top colleges in the country. So that's where we come from. Whatever works for children, we ought to support. Our children, our families, and communities, particularly low-income kids of color, do not have time for these polarized conversations that aren't rooted in what's best for kids. And so that's where we stand, and that's where we're always going to stand.
What's on the debater and I have morning drinks? I'm sorry. Fresh off the plane, I washed my face and walked up here. So, Nicholas, how are you doing?
I think I have the crowd really close, like an NC. So, here, let me turn this up a little bit. So, I think the first thing it's important for me to say that I'm a former instructor from a charter school, Inspired Charter School in California. I'm a former charter school board member. I'm a former charter school parent. I volunteered in Minnesota charter schools in the 1990s when they first started. I even donated to Making Waves Charter School in Northern California. But as many of you know, there are some bad actors out there in the charter school sector as well as the neighborhood school sector. So talking about the Credo studies, I think it's important to sort of drill down. I was in Reading, Pennsylvania 2 weeks ago, and the reason why I was there was because the charter authorizer, the local school district, had determined that the schools in that city were low performing. So they went to them as the authorizer, as they should, held them accountable and said, we're going to close your schools because you're low performing across the country. Well, the charters didn't like that, and they fought them in court. And now $500 million later, the community decided they have to form about this. So I decided I'd take a look at, well, what do the charter numbers, the Credo charter numbers, look like on the East Coast? So looking at the Pennsylvania numbers, they're negative across the board. If you look at the Philadelphia numbers, they actually look positive. And they look positive because Asian and white students in Philadelphia do really well in charters, but Latino and African American kids actually have a negative impact. Now, in Newark, I took a look at Credo's Newark numbers too, and you can see that charters overall have a positive impact. But for African Americans, they actually have a negative impact for peer studies, and a small positive impact for Latinos. The standard deviation, how many of you read stats courses? So the standard deviation change for Latinos was 0.04 positive. If you look at overall, the overall Credo study numbers in urban vision study, you can see that the standard deviation changes in the thousands of standard deviations for Latinos and hundreds of standard deviations for African Americans. Now, here's the challenge. The challenge is that we know there are bad actors out there in the chart side. And the numbers are going to continue to be very small in terms of positive impact until we hold those bad actors to accountability and transparency instead. I think that is in the best interest of all those folks who support charter schools. Because what happens is those people that are very critical of charter schools will continue to communicate with policymakers that there are these discipline issues, that there are challenges with malfeasance, financial malfeasance. So I think, I was on the radio with Howard Fuller last year having a conversation. And at the time, Andre Perry asked me, where is it that people like NAACP and other groups can work with the charter sector, the charter lobbying associations? Where can we work together? And it's fun. I thought to myself, I really don't see a place of contract. I'll be honest, that's what I said at the time. But as I thought about that question over the last year, I think that place is transparency and accountability. And that's one of the things that's happening in California right now. We've got to find ways to make sure that these are open to the public. We've got to find ways to make sure that discipline data for Black and brown boys is available to the public. We've got to find ways to make sure that teacher data is available. We've got to find ways to make sure that the way monies are spent is available to the public. I think that is the place. We want the charter movement to survive and thrive. There must be transparency and accountability. I think that's where the NAACP was the last thing I said. How many of you have the NAACP call for a moratorium? Now, the NAACP moratorium is kind of like the Constitution and the Bible. Most of us know it's around, but we haven't spent a lot of time reading it. And the thing is that what the NAACP moratorium actually says is concerned about these transparency and accountability provisions. But because the charter sector, many people in the charter sector, especially the lobbying association, have been willing to listen to these concerns, we're calling for a moratorium. So please, check out that moratorium. I think if you look at the actual resolution and find that, you will probably agree with the fact that more transparency and accountability is needed.
I think when we talk about education, one of the most prominent words that all of us should get used to using is context. And so I'm going to speak from the contextual point of view and in answering the question of the way I came to be the founder of our first charter schools. Our first charter school, Family Life Academy, approximately 16 years ago, was that I was a pastor at School District 9, which at that time was the bottom school district of all school districts in New York City. So I was just tired of our children continuously failing. Since I've been an activist, I just celebrated 50 years as a pastor in New York City. I've been involved for a long time, and really things haven't changed as far as the majority of our children continuously failing. So my roots are in the community control battles of the 60s. Ocean Hill, Brownsville, I marched across the bridge for community control, and our moderator says he's an expert on drinking. Well, during that time there was an educational leader named Al Van, who later became a councilman of the Assemblyman. He was the president of the African American Teachers Association. There were other activists in Brownsville, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and we fought for community control. A part of my contribution at this conference, since I'm going to be 71, is historical memory. Because those that fail to understand their history will repeat the same mistakes over and over again. So, moving into the community control battles of the 60s, which led to the famous strike, which polarized the city and called many of us in communities of color anti-Semitic, which that was the root of that whole strike, because now communities of color were hiring more Black and Latino teachers, and of course, always the nuances when we have power to make decisions, some power we water down. Right? we've watered down the process. Like that was going to be in our interest to hire incompetent teachers intentionally. So, of course, the strike broke community control. As a result of that, we got decentralization, which certainly wasn't perfect, but there was more public accountability. We elected some school board members under the pretext that some school boards were corrupt, which they certainly were. They dismantled decentralization. They didn't dismantle the Board of Education, which has been corrupt, or the Assembly, which has been corrupt, or the State Senate, which has been corrupt, but somehow our people bought that lock, stock, and barrel and actually participated in ending decentralization, which had more accountability than now, where there's no public accountability in New York City. All of these committees have really no power except advisory power. In my day, marital control would have been blasphemy, because all of our activists believe that decisions should be made as close as possible to where the children are. That's where the decision-making process should take place. So, 16 years ago, I saw the legislation on charter schools, and I come at it from a different perspective. I read it and I said, wow, you can hire your own teachers. Wow, you can hire your own principals. Wow, school board members can be appointed that potentially reflect the community. That sounds like community control to me. In the context of communities of color, I saw the charter school law as a potential instrument for community control. Again, in other areas, it can be an instrument for privatizing schools. Since I'm a minister, it depends on the intention of the heart. But if you want to use it for community control, you can. That was my motivation. Now, 17 years later, we have 3 schools. We're one of the highest performing in the state. When we look at outperforming all schools, our population is majority Latino English language learners in the charter. Our intention is to go after English language learners and special needs children. And we've been answering others. We've been highly successful as far as meeting the educational standards that we authorize and provide. Of course, that's not all. We believe in holistic education. I'm a veteran of District School 4. I worked with Emily Castro, was here as a superintendent, with Debbie Myers. My son was from the 3rd graduating class of Central Park East Side, and I was an executive board member of the PTA. The untold story this morning is that I used to be at Debbie's house in her brownstone. I don't know if she wants me to reveal that, organizing school board elections in the house, in her house, because the untold story is that you have to have community power in order to hire an Alvarado, to hire a Medina, that allow, from an institutional bureaucratic perspective, Debbie to do some of the things that she did, because the resistance came from the central board, maybe I'll offend some people here, and from unions to the small alternative school movement. That's where most of the resistance came. So I hope that my contribution to historical memory, at least in the context of New York City, helps. So when we romanticize all these things, it is good to go back and study the history of how some of these things took form. In my district, District 9, now District 7, where we have our other 2 schools, the answer is a resounding, unequivocal yes. Charter schools, as we define them, community-grown charter schools, are definitely serving the needs of children.
Helping everyone else. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so very much for inviting me to the conversation. The first thing, before I get into NAACP's moratorium, and just a quick raise of hands, how many of you have actually read it and read the report that we did afterwards? Okay. lets me know what my audience where my audience is. So before we get to that conversation, my position, the position of Brooklyn NAACP, which I had, as well as other NAACP peers and other people who care about the education of our children in our community, we believe the conversation and the back and forth on charter versus traditional public is a distraction. Particularly because the focus is to get us to focus on the merits or anecdotal stories of what works and what doesn't work in individual schools and individual classrooms, instead of talking about the system overall and how the system needs to be reformed. And so when you get in a conversation and letting someone else define for you what the battle is, right? So the battle has been defined for us as charter versus traditional, rather than reforming how we fund public schools in the first place, how they're governed in the first place, and the accountability and transparency of public education, right? So I don't choose to fight in that ring, because that is an argument that has been defined by others who don't have the same intent of the heart, as Pastor said, of what is best for our children, right? So I don't answer questions, and I always, rephrase the conversation on what our beliefs are. And our beliefs are that we believe in public education. We believe in transparency and in community control, say-so, and input of public education, and ensuring that we are providing resources to educate children, whether they're in inner cities, as they're called, whether they're in suburbs, or wherever they are, providing the resources for young people to have a quality education, K-12 education that prepares them for being productive adults. And that's not necessarily pushing them that they necessarily will be, Ivy League, school, because again, those terms are defined for us. We define success in a proper education as being able to go to college or being able to go to an Ivy League college or, get a scholarship. That is not success that I define for all of the children in the borough of Brooklyn where I serve, right? So again, it's about defining for ourselves what we believe in terms of public education. And that's particularly our view. So then if you start with that premise, then you then put all schools, how all schools are governed, under a microscope. And that includes traditional public schools. I can tell you from District 16, where I am, and other districts in New York City, that there are some schools in the traditional public school system that are appalling. Our reading scores are appalling. Preparing our children for being productive adults is appalling. And at the same time, we have the same criticism of independent schools or charter schools that exist as well. The difficulty is that there is some semblance of community input in traditional public schools versus charter schools, and the ability to make change, to actually see the numbers, to actually have input in how things are governed, it becomes difficult. Now, there is also, from our perspective, we don't believe that there should be for-profit entities governing public schools at all. That goes to the pastor's comment about intent of the heart. I have a difficulty believing that your intent is to educate and properly educate and provide equal resources for students when you are set up as a for-profit, and you have to answer to shareholders, and you have to make money, because that is the purpose. I own a business. The purpose of my business is to make me money, right? But that is different from the purpose that may exist of the work that we do through Brooklyn NAACP, or a traditional public school, or even a community-based charter school. The intent of a community-based charter school, such as the pastor mentioned, such as Ricky has, or such as all of you may work or participate in, is education. And so we have a fundamental problem with that. So going to the NAACP's moratorium, it was particularly interesting coming out that I was at the convention, when we voted on that, and sort of immediately, people always talk about the NAACP ain't doing nothing, and then as soon as we do something you don't like, it's all over the news. Right? So immediately after, we voted on that, sort of the moratorium came out, sort of everyone started texting and emailing me and asking me, what is this or whatever, before even actually reading is the, 2.5, like not even 2.5 pages of moratorium that specifically state the issues that we're bringing up in terms of a moratorium. Right? And for those of you who have read it, you know what it says. It talks about the lack of transparency and accountability. It talks about how schools are funded, right? It talks about being against for-profit entities. It specifically lays out, we didn't do one sentence, right? We specifically laid out the reason why, and for an entire year, we went across the country holding public hearings in town halls in communities where the charter schools were, and asking the community, asking the teachers, asking those charter schools to provide input on those things that we laid out in the resolution. And from that, we then produced a report. And in that report, again, the hands up of people who've actually read the detail of that, right? That specifically states these are things that people agreed with across the board. And so what our call is for, just, like anything else, is not to, in one fell swoop, close all charter schools the next day, but really to take a pause and say, how can we address these issues that are not just the concern of the NAACP as an organization, but our concerns of parents, our concerns of teachers, our concerns of administrators all across the country, who are raising alarms and saying, yes, I have anecdotal stories that there are statistics that back up that there are charter schools that are doing wonderful work in their communities. But there are also those bad actors. And so as a government, right, as a government that provides public funding that is our money to these entities to provide public education, then the burden is on us to put a pause and say, okay, how can we ensure that there's greater transparency? How can we ensure that the charter schools that are doing great, that we continue the original purpose and making sure there's a dialogue and conversation on how we take some of those things and put it in a traditional school setting? How do we eliminate, because there's a line in the sand for me in terms of a for-profit entity running public education, right? So that is something that is immediate and should be addressed. And then the also issue, Brooklyn University specifically raises alarm in terms of co-location, and I know it was mentioned previously already, is we believe that it's unfair both to the charter and the traditional public school, right? So are we as a society actually building more space for schools, period? And instead of, creating again an argument to pit schools against each other, instead of talking overall about how much money, what the accountability is, and fundamentally changing how we fund schools and school districts in the first place. And so those are the issues that we raise. And again, like I tell everybody that emails and texts me and continues to do so about our issue on charter school, the first thing I'm asking is, have you read it? Have you read the report? If you haven't, do your homework and then come back and talk to me.
This is great. Lots of different opinions.
So it's actually definitely what she said. So if you would actually like to read the report, I can give you a web address right now. It's bit.ly/NAACP, all caps. It's very important. You have such a caps right. NAACP, quality with a capital Q, education with a capital E, and report with a capital R. And you can see it right away if you like.
Well, this is great. So lots of different opinions. I'll note there was one unanimous point. No one is for the for-profit charter schools. As moderator, I felt like I shouldn't be applauding one way or the other, but we agree with the panel here that for those are not what we're talking about here. Let me raise the question about school diversity and school segregation. As I mentioned, Al Shanker was for charter schools with the idea that you could bring kids of different backgrounds together. You can put a charter school anywhere. You can put it in a mixed income neighborhood. You can draw kids from across boundaries. So they have tremendous potential to be more integrated than traditional public schools. Research from Gary Ortfield and others suggests that in fact they're more segregated on average than traditional public schools, which is a pretty hard thing to beat. And yet we see a growing number of diverse by design charter schools. In Brooklyn, there's Brooklyn Prospect and Community Roots that set aside seats to make sure that a school doesn't become predominantly middle class or one particular race, but has some seats set aside for students who live in the nearby public housing project. So there are things that charter schools should do, or could do, to be more diverse. Now, Ray, you mentioned the Ocean Hill-Brownsville community control movement, which had a different emphasis. It wasn't prioritizing integration, it was prioritizing community control. So should we care about school diversity? Should that be something that charter schools try to achieve, or is that not really their job?
So this is not only a subject in education or reform issues. Speaking as a pastor, we have a whole issue now in Christian church of multicultural churches versus homogeneous churches. And somehow the paradigm of multicultural churches is really the body of Christ. The homogeneous ones become second level body. In other words, the implication that somehow multiculturalism or diversity is superior, kind of the nuance by implication to the homogeneous content. So, how do I feel about it? I believe in homegrown leadership. I believe in indigenous leadership. When I started Flax, it was very intentional to go after indigenous leadership, indigenous educators. We had a target population. It was the English language immigrant that everyone agreed the school system was failing. I wasn't concerned about having 30 whites, 30 blacks, and 30 Latinos and busing them in from Riverdale or some other community. I have read the data that when children of color are in an intercultural setting, they tend to learn more because of the experiences of other people and maybe middle class, upper class folks that are exposed to other things that the children of poverty are not is beneficial. So I don't deny that is something that's positive. But was that my primary motivation? Absolutely not. I knew that for 50 years since I've been involved, the school system has been basically failing the majority of children, and generations have been lost. So my primary motivation, can children of color learn if we have the right visionary leadership at the top, excellent teachers in the classroom, and a community of parents that are engaged? That was the model, that was the conceptual framework that I went after. If as a result, now that High Bridge is finally being potentially gentrified, in our context, you can't live in Manhattan anymore, so some whites are coming across the bridge, the Willis Avenue Bridge, and into the Bronx, and organically, that happens. It happens, and more children come into our schools because of the diversity that those neighborhoods will have. I'm more for organic growth. I'm more for contextual growth than I am for busing at any cost, whether that means intentional bringing kids from all over the city. So my model is more organic, it's indigenous. That's where my priority is. And I don't think, while it's a good thing, I don't think integration is a foundational pillar to excellence. I think kids can be in a homogeneous setting, and there's 5 African American students in the public school system, almost even schools, something, right? People academies doing very well, pretty much all African American, they're learning. So one size doesn't fit all. I don't think we should label integrated multicultural schools somehow superior to the homogeneous one.
So the data on this is pretty clear, I think, about the fact that on average, the statistics show, I think your Northfield study shows, that charges 16% more segregated nationally. And this is a real challenge for us. The research is showing that what happens is that when parents choose, they're already coming from segregated schools. That's often what you hear. Our traditional neighborhood schools are already segregated. What's happening is when parents are choosing, they're choosing schools that are even more segregated than the ones that they left. This is one of the ones I struggle with. You know, when my daughter was in charter school, she would come home, one day she'd come home, she was talking about young people. And the next day she came home, she was talking about how her friend's uncle had shot somebody and had gone to jail the day before. And then the next day she was talking about vegans, right? And so this was a really diverse setting that she was in, right? And I think I think the bigger picture is that we have to make a decision. Because in this country, we've lived in balkanized neighborhoods for a long time. And I think part of what's going on with our schools, or a lot of what's going on with our schools, is that we have unhealthy communities in most of our major urban cities. And our schools represent that. And so that's a real challenge. Now, with the traditional public schools, you go to the East University African American Law Review talking about, because in parents involved, the Supreme Court made involuntary desegregation by race basically illegal. So what Berkeley and some other places have done is they've done desegregation based on SES instead of on race, and they've been able to do that using census tracts. And in the study we did in the Berkeley Review of Education, we found that you could do that. You could do that. You could desegregate schools if you use SES by census tract. Now, I don't know how you would do that in a choice center. I, myself, have struggled with how we fix this. How do we address the fact that parents are choosing schools that are more segregated than the schools that they're leaving? I'm looking for good ideas. I would love to study this. I don't know if, and I'm really sympathetic to the fact, for example, in Sacramento, there are African American educators that are saying our students have not been served in Sacramento city schools for a long time. And so we're going to do our own homogeneous thing just with black kids. But then those kids don't experience people from other backgrounds until they get to college. And when I was at the University of Michigan, there were many students from Detroit who had not, and I went to school that was fairly diverse, so that was normal and natural for me. And I'm not that person that says, you know, African American Latino kids have to be exposed to white kids and automatically lead to benefit. I think it's also the other way, as Pastor spoke. So I think this is one of the most challenging issues that we have in the choice movement today, and I'm not sure that I've seen any solutions out there on how we get it.
We have to deal with the fact that the public charter schools generally target the most disadvantaged young people, which tend to be African American, Latinos, and lower-income communities. The reality is, for 40 years, white people don't want to live in those communities. Period. So we can dance around that and pretend. So the charters are a symptom of the fact that white people don't want to be in communities with black and brown people. That's the reality. And I started off as a civil rights attorney. And post-Brown for about 40 years, we had all sorts of busing decrees trying to compel white people and black and brown kids to be in the same districts, and there was all types of political backlash. And it got to the point we got to Milliken 2, where the Supreme Court said no more, and then it led over the next 30 years to cases like Missouri v. Jenkins and ultimately Parents Involved, where there isn't even a jurisprudential hook for that anymore. Beyond the fact there's no political hook, and beyond the fact even when you have schools that have facial diversity, look under the hood, and what do you see? Black and brown kids tracked to remedial classes. Black and brown kids overclassified as special ed. So the problem is white supremacy. The problem is it's charter schools. So this is really it's an absurd conversation, right? So unless we're going to deal with those meta issues, then the question becomes, so people like me, as someone to the pastor says, look, if these people don't want to be in our communities, And if they don't want our kids in their schools, and even if they happen to get there, then they're going to track them into remedial classes or find them to have behavioral disabilities, we got to educate our babies where they are. And guess what? It actually got to have some internalized white supremacy in you to think that black and brown kids can't learn unless some white kids learn. White kids figure out a way to learn without us. So we can learn how to compute math and read and analyze critically without having a white folk around. Now that said, to be clear, it's best for all kids in our democracy to learn from one another because it breaks down the stereotypes. Right? So I want to be clear about that. So it's not as if the black and brown kids go and then they're magically around the white kids. And they learn, no, everybody learns something to be around one another. That I think is a critical thing for our democracy, particularly in these polarized times. However, at the same time, we have a historical record. And what black and brown families say is what the pastors say. We would love to be in an integrated environment. We don't want to be in the hood all the time with just us in broken down communities and all sort of toxic conditions that we're living in. But this is the reality of what we have. We're going to make the best of it. And the best of it means if we got to create our own schools, because many of us who support public charter schools resulted from a self-determination type of perspective. We can create our own. Right? We don't have to, and this idea about who can influence what. If anybody thinks that an individual parent has more of a capacity to influence a bureaucracy like the New York City Department of Education versus an individual public charter school, you're out of your mind. The amount of political engagement and resource it takes to move that bureaucracy is simply way beyond the capacity of individual parents, whereas they do actually have the ultimate power in public charter school. I'm out. You're not educating my baby the right way, I'm out tomorrow. You can't do that in traditional public context. And with that said, I did want to say one last thing, because there's a lot of back and forth around the Credo study and some cherry picking around individual districts. So I think it's important to root all of this in empiricism. Because the Credo study is the gold standard in this context, and I don't know if anyone challenges that. Across all urban regions in the country in the Credo study, black students in poverty received the equivalent of 59 days of additional learning in math and 44 days of additional learning in reading compared to their peers in the traditional public schools. Across all urban regions in the country, Hispanic students in poverty experienced the equivalent of 48 days of additional learning in math and 25 days of additional learning in reading. Because you want to know who wasn't at the table when the NAACP passed the moratorium? The parents and the families. That's the bottom line. Because the parents and the families, they want, frankly, the same thing that the leadership in NAACP has endured for themselves for decades. They don't live in the hood anymore. And that's the reality. And they darn sure don't put their kids in the same schools that they want our babies to be locked into. Right? So that's the issue. So no one would dispute, absolutely, we absolutely oppose for-profit public charter. They should be banned across the board. Fortunately, there's only a handful of states that have it. That should be extended more broadly. Absolutely, there should be more transparency. Why not have a rule that says we urge all public charter schools to have more transparency, however in the world the NAACP wants to define that. Right? So, but to throw the baby out with the bathwater in a context where we know black kids are vulnerable. We don't have a lot. So whatever option we have that can create opportunity for young people, we got to enjoy it. If we have to fix some things, we fix it. Because if anything, we really need a moratorium. We need a moratorium on these failing traditional public schools that have failed our communities for 30, 40 years. Where's the moratorium on that?
Well, first I would say that, starting from the last to the first, that I do take issue with the fact that parents and community members or teachers were not at the table when this conversation of the moratorium came forward. And particularly because if you know how the process of resolutions happen in the NAACP, they come from the individual branches, which are made up of local and independent, local communities. Right? So it does not come from the top. It comes from those branches in communities across the country and then moves up the way to a national conversation. So the fact that of saying that there were not parents and teachers or other community members a part of that conversation, that's absolutely false. Because this came from parents and other teachers who had these issues in their individual communities. So that's false. But again, we're redefining the conversation of again, charter versus traditional public, rather than talking about the larger issue of funding and education overall. Because the reason why there is less funding in our communities for education or the distribution of public education funding is not just because of elected officials deciding where money goes. That's 60% part of it. But also it's because of where the money comes in terms of the tax base, in terms of communities, in terms of where people live, right? And so that's what we're talking about. If we want to change the structure, we also have to change fundamentally how much funding and where the funding comes from in order to provide that those resources. Second is the resources overall for public education. And where, particularly in our communities, that there is all of a sudden in certain schools, new schools or other charter schools or other places that exist, there is new resources and new opportunities that traditional public schools don't have access to. And so those things are fundamental things that are, I agree with wholeheartedly. I think it's insulting to say, I think it's insulting, thank you. I think it's insulting to say to us and for us to say to each other that children, people of color cannot learn without white people being around us. Particularly when we have a history. Before we were even integrated with the rest of the country, we were producing public education on our own, right? From Reconstruction all the way, because there was no other opportunity. So to suggest to me, or for us to suggest to each other, I'm always pushing, even my members or other people in terms of saying that, right? The type of messages that we're even sending to our children, that the best school that they can go to has to have all white children in it. And that the teachers that you learn from have to be white, or you have to leave your community to go to this private school, as upper middle class black folks sometimes do, right? That we send our kids outside of the community in which we live. And you are reiterating this message to our young people that in order to be successful, you have to leave your own community and seek education and seek resources from others outside of the community. That's very damaging. And it continues to perpetuate that I have to leave my community, that I cannot stay here and help build in my community, right? So additionally, again, I like to go back to definitions. If we're talking about diversity, what do you mean? Do you mean just diversity of skin color? Are we talking about class? Are we talking about the diversity of the teachers who are in front of you, the diversity of the resources that you have access to? Right? Because it's all, you can take, sometimes people define diversity as leaving Bed-Stuy to go to Lincoln Center for a day. That's not diversity to me, right? So it's all, again, how we define it. And cherry picking and deciding I want a racial mix in a classroom is also not the same thing. But there needs to be diversity and equity in terms of the administration, in terms of the teachers, in terms of the curriculum, right, to make sure that it actually speaks to the young people that you have in your classroom, right? So again, I think everyone has said on this panel so far that if we go to the root of the issue, we're on the same page. The same page is how do we create an education system in this country that provides equity and equitable education to every child, no matter if they're in Bed-Stuy or the Upper West Side, whether they're in a traditional public school, whether they're in a charter school. Dr. Lester Young, who, I've worked with in community hall, he's actually done, I have a whole podcast that teaches civics. And when we did the episode on public education, right, he talks about how there has always been choice. In our communities, you can choose to go to a traditional public school. You could have chosen to go to the Catholic school, right? You could have chosen to go. There's always been choice in our communities. The difference is that we as a society, through government entities, through public policy, are stripping away the resources that exist for traditional public schools, that is creating the environment that we are now pushing that charter schools are the only thing that should exist, or the only method that exists to properly educate children. And that is what we're disagreeing. We want the choice. I don't want to interfere. If you individually want to send your child to the traditional public school that's around the corner from you versus you sending them to it's none of my business. But what is our business collectively is if we're going to put money and resources, our tax dollars, into public education, then the system overall needs to be equitable for that individual parent to make that choice, right? But it can't be a false choice. You can't say that there's a lottery that exists, your ticket out of your community. The choice should be made up to the individual parent on what's best for them and their kid, not necessarily that this is the only choice I have is to send them to this one because there's no other place that exists or can properly educate them. And we've created the system. We are continuing to maintain this system of inequity because we are not properly funding and supporting the traditional public schools in this current climate. So the fight, again, is not traditional versus charter school. It is not, and we have to get out of the ring of that conversation and take it to the larger conversation of how do we create a system that is equitable, whatever choice a parent makes, that there is a quality education in any of those choices. So if we can get out of that ring, right, that has been defined by others for us, then we can have that conversation.
What up? So I want to talk about two quick things. One, community control, and two, freedom. Just some context on freedom. You know, Nicholas, Dr. Meyer's son, I think we had 8 stats classes together when we were at Stanford. So let me just give you a couple of quick things to understand about freedom. The first is that freedom doesn't actually compare schools. It compares students that attend schools. Now, one of the interesting things about samples there, students, is that they only take comparison students, charter school students, from schools that actually set students to charter schools. So what that means is that it biases the estimates downward, because any high-performing neighborhood school that's not losing any students to charter is not going to be in a comparison group. So I think that's one important thing to understand. The second thing, the Strino likes to talk about this days of instruction or learning. Now, many of you have seen standardized tests, right? And you know that typically they have like 50, 60 questions or so, depending on the test. Now, when they talk about days of instruction, what they've done statistically is they've said, okay, in the case of African Americans, the benefit is, I think, 0.008 or 0.05. Latino, something very similar. And then what they do is they say, they translate that to a large number of days of learning, even though it's a very small standard deviation. I don't get into the weeds, but it's important to understand this because things like class size reduction have like a 400% larger impact in standard deviation change than the very small impact of the Pareto station. So if you turn the class size, and don't quote me on this number, I know probably a journalist here that's going to say you did the wrong math, but basically multiply the 0.2 standard deviations instead of 0.04 times days of learning, and you're talking about months of learning that you gain from class size reduction, right? So it's just a contextual piece that there are problems with Pareto studies. Those are some of the concerns in the statistical academic community. One, the sample is actually compared, and two, how they set it into days of learning is problematic. It can be even 1 or 2 questions on a test, maybe even half a question, depending on the size of the test. And then finally, a piece about community control. I think I'm a big supporter of community control. Deb Meyer commented on my blog many years ago, 2012. I came up with an idea called community-based accountability. It was in the height of No Child Left Behind. And the idea was that communities would have a say in how the district spends its money and do it strategically, which is kind of like a gut statement, right? Well, California took that idea and made it policy for the entire state. So now communities have the ability to design the strategic plan and how the monies are spent for low-income kids, foster kids, and English language learners. That is community control. And it's not just neighborhood public schools and districts that do this. The charter schools also have this approach. In LA, the strategic plan is worth $1 billion. And over the last 7 years, pre and post, they're called LCAP, Local Control Accountability Plan, we've seen an increase in 20% of funding in LA and other large urban districts. So there is ways that one parent, a group of parents, can have an impact on a strategic approach to cover money instead, because in California we have this good community way of doing it.
Since I'm a pastor on the panel, sometimes I use other language. From a theological perspective, we believe in the kingdom. And the kingdom for us is when everything's going to be okay and every tear will be wiped away and there'll be a new heaven and a new earth and we're all, from my faith perspective, we're all longing for that consummation to come. That's how I see systemic reform. It's the kingdom. And yes, we're all looking for that day when everyone will be together, and but in the meantime, I got to deal with Pat Robertson. I got to deal with Jerry Falwell. I got to deal with my actual context. And while the way I contribute to the universal struggle in my district, the Parent Action Network, a public school network, meets in my building. Mothers on the move, they come. We collaborate with all the public schools trying to reform. Even though we're a charter, since we're community grown, they accept us. I host them. So that's my struggle to the universal part. But I'm sorry, I just can't wait another 50 years for systemic reform to take place. I have to do my part, and everyone has a calling. My passion has been, let's create an alternative right now. And for me, community-based charter schools were one. In my prior incarnation, which was in District 4, where my educational formation comes from, where Debbie was at and Evan Castro, there was alternative schools. And the untold story is that there was a tremendous amount of resistance toward alternative schools. From the CSA, from the UFT, from local politicians. And so reform is always born out of struggle. And that struggle is not because the system woke up one day and said, you know what, we're going to give everyone an equal amount of money. We're going to redistribute all these things. That's pie in the sky stuff. Yes, we can organize toward that end, but it's difficult to say the least. I've been at it, 50 years. And my job in District 4, I was Director of Parent Involvement. In District 1, I was Director of Parent Involvement. I ran the Pueblo Niño slate, that anyone that knows educational history in District 1 and District 4, that was the parent slate. And you know who ran against us? UFD, CSA, politicians that had their own patronage bills that used the schools as patronage, and they were not for empowering parents. I'm not talking about the type of parent that's controlled by the principal. Yes, come on. Oh, I'm not talking about the type of PTA that was just an extension of the school. I'm talking about independent, empowered parents that were organized and that really wanted to do some significant change. One more point about funding. I agree with funding. But as the founder of our charter schools, I always raise the issue. One of the issues that all the authorizers and all the think tanks say, you got to get rich people on your board. They're going to bring the money in. And I remember in our alternative school movement, we had creative directors that would bring in extra money. And they would do beautiful things. But when the money dried up, they were in crisis. When the extra money dried up, the tendency was to be in crisis. In my board, I said, look, we're going to meet the standards. We're going to try to do everything we do with the actual allotment of money that we get. If we get extra, that's great. That's great. But we're going to try to do it within the allocation, because I have seen, and I've seen the schools that bring in a lot of money and they can do beautiful things, and I'm all for that. And I'm rich. Matter of fact, there's any fuckers out there, we're receiving money. So we'll take it. But my philosophical principle was, let's do it within our allocation, because then when we don't have the extras, we're not running around thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen now? So funding is important, But to say that funding is synonymous with excellence, I also think is a mystery.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go to audience questions, and so there's a mic here and there's a mic there. Just before we start, I just want to say one thing for the record, because there wasn't. I think there was agreement on the panel that integrated schools that are based on the idea that black and brown kids will learn better sitting next to white kids have no basis in evidence. No one has ever argued that. The diverse by design charter schools are following 50 years of research to suggest that economically disadvantaged students do better. In fact, on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, low-income students are 2 years ahead of low-income students in high-poverty schools when they have a chance to go to economically mixed schools. That economically segregated schools are rarely equal. Just to clarify that point, because we don't have someone on the panel here from a diverse charter school. So that is the argument. So Joy, you want to respond to that, and then we'll go to Joe.
I was just making a point about that, looking at the data of that, is that because the school is better resourced, rather than them physically being in the building next to, adjacent to, rubbing off smartness from white people.
I think we're all in agreement on that. Okay, Joe.
So it looks like this mic is not on, so I have read NAACP. I have read the NAACP statement a number of times. And I want to point out something that has not been discussed, because I think it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the chartering idea. The chartering idea is that there will be more than one entity in a state that has the power to create new public schools. Many of these people in this room who have created independent schools were authorized by somebody other than the local district. If you were authorized by some other in a local district, would you raise your hand? Okay. But here's what the NAACP says. The NAACP says states should only allow districts to serve as authorized. States should only allow districts to serve as authorized. That is a fundamental attack on the central idea of chartering, and whether you are with or for the NAACP's other statements, and I think there's a lot of good in the NAACP, that reinforces the power of districts which millions of people of color and low-income white people have rejected. So I think that's a real important thing to remember. Second and last point. We have this big debate about credo. We have a big debate about standardized tests, but you know what? The vast majority of people in America are looking for a lot more from their schools than from standardized tests. And I think it's a tragedy of the first order that people ignored what we will pass out tomorrow, which was the first charter bill that said that one of the central ideas of chartering, which, by the way, there are a lot of progressive district educators who agree with, one of the central ideas is to have a much broader array of assessments. And that's what people in this country are looking for. And there are people in districts and charters who are working together on this. I think it's really sad that when the NAACP issued the statement, it ignored that. I think it's really sad that it ignored the idea that chartering is beyond district schools. And finally, and I will pass this out tomorrow, we hear a lot about Al Shanker, but it was actually Kenneth Clark in 1968, and people will see this tomorrow, who said we ought to have alternative public schools outside the control of district schools. And people will see that evidence tomorrow.
So I would agree with your point about starting with the later and then the first, about using standardized testing and having different assessments. That's something we actually have another resolution on across the country, is specifically focusing on different assessment models. I believe in, as someone who doesn't, who's never tested well, I went to public schools, never tested well, and so would do great in school and then fail every test almost. So I understand and sympathize that assessment is different for different children, and the standardized test should be used primarily to gauge how children are doing and accepting information and how they may benefit from different instruction. So that's one. To your other point about the chartering entity being based upon districts, I personally actually agree with you, and it was actually something that was brought up in the NAACP conversations across the country, the different town halls that were had. And that's largely because districts are different across the country, right? So our districts in New York City, we're in a larger, district, whereas you go into Long Island and there are smaller districts, and the same thing across the country. So I think that's and it came up, like I said, where we had both other charters and parents and teachers bringing up that same issue in the town halls that were had across the country, and I think is reflected in the Post report in terms of some of the criticism of that. But that's largely due to the translation of how districts are different across the country. And so for Mississippi or other places where the districts, or other smaller communities where the districts are smaller and made up of community members and still have school boards and things like that, there is this implication that they are made up of community folks and therefore should have greater say versus being in a district like New York City where you can't compare that district to a smaller district. But I hear you, and I, understand that point.
So, I think we go back to Deborah B. Turlington in Florida back in the early 1980s. And the NAACP has been proposed standardized testing for quite a long time. So I checked that case out in Florida. It was a case where the court essentially said, well, these tests are unfair, they don't adequately measure African American achievement, but that's okay. That's essentially what the court said in that case. I think on the piece about the local district, I think the idea is that the folks that I talk to, I'm in the executive committee about the NAACP, but I should say I'm not speaking to the NAACP today. I'm really very careful about that. But I think just in hearing some of the conversations around it, the idea is that they want those decisions about authorizing to be made as close to the communities as possible. Now, whether that's local or whether that's county, and the reason for that is this, is that in California, you can ask the local district, the local district says no, then you ask the county says no, it goes to the state. That's like asking my mom for candy, she says no, dad for candy, says no, let me go ask my neighbor. So I think that there's a place for conversation around that. The idea is that they want those decisions to be as democratic and local as possible. I think that's the reason behind that. Maybe that's local district, maybe that's some other local entity. I think that's still something that folks are thinking about. The person who invented church. So I had a conversation with Charles Stewart, calls himself Citizen Stewart. He's been with Education Code, and he said that Ralph Budd, and Diane Ravitch in the book also attributed to the charter schools throughout. I mean, there's a lot of conversations about who was the first person who had the idea about charters, or who first uttered the word charter. But I think that it's pretty clear there's a few people in historical record that really brought those ideas to prominence. And even though Al Shanker never said he invented the idea, I think he's one of those people that brought the idea to prominence with those particular principles we talked about.
I just want to clarify also really quickly in terms of, in opposition of standardized testing, I'm always careful of my language and saying to make sure that we're not saying that Black and brown kids can't achieve and can't pass tests, because that's not true, right? But there is some conversation about standardized testing being the only barometer, and particularly standardized testing overall having equitable issues in terms of how they're phrased and how they're used. So there's a difference. There's not like, Black and brown kids can't pass tests, kind of thing, but more or less that how the test is used as a barometer of education.
Afraid I was told we need to stop right at 12, so I'm sorry we didn't get more questions in. But please join me in thanking our panelists here for their service.
I got a couple of quick announcements here that are really important. Look on your badge. You probably can tell at the bottom of the badge you'll see an A or a B. Lunch is divided into two sections.